I'm Sarah Humphrey. I'm a GP by background, and I'm the clinical lead for the Yorkshire and Humber Clinical Network, Dementia, Older People's Mental Health. And a lot of you will have been on these calls before and sort of know the format. I'm going to introduce our speaker, who's Dr. Charles Alessi, a fellow GP and formerly a senior advisor to Public Health England on dementia and productive ageing. We wanted to do a session today on brain health and what that means. I'm hoping that Charles will give us probably 20 to 30 minutes with some information that maybe we can then talk about. As Colin said, this is a interactive session, so if you're really quiet, you can pop things in the chat box and we'll pick them up. But you can pop your hand up and we'll ask you then to speak once Charles has finished his session, if that works best for him. So with no further ado, I think looking at the numbers, we're now a reasonable number. So I'm going to ask Dr. Charles Alessi to take over.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Sarah, and thank you, Colin, as well. I'm delighted to be here amongst friends, in essence. Today, I'm just going to have a chat with you all, and I hope we keep this discursive, in essence, a conversation. Really, I'm going to focus a little bit on cognition and dementia, because in many respects, to a degree, that is what has affected and continues to affect aging in a significant way. And dispel some myths and also give you a sitrep, in essence, in terms of where we are with treatments and where we are with what we can do around the whole of this area. So that's the approach I'm going to be taking. As I said, it's really a situation, a sitrep in terms of where we are with treatment, because we see and hear an awful lot about treatment for dementia, around management of dementia, and I think it would be useful just to get a snapshot of where we are with all the new treatments that are in development, and also that are being hyped as being the next big answer. Sadly, we're in a world with dementia where we've been looking for the magic bullet for the last 30 or 40 years, mainly unsuccessfully. Dementia is a horrendously complex condition, and the number of things that affect it, of course, are so many that looking for treatment often is like trying to play four-dimensional chess, because you're managing a whole host of different issues. But let's go through where we are with treatment at the moment. So we all have heard of plaques, beta amyloid plaques, the pathognomonic to a degree, the areas where the finding of these plaques assist with the diagnosis of dementia, made up of beta amyloid. And now there is a significant effort to try to manage the formation of these plaques using drugs called monoclonal antibodies. I'll be saying a little bit more about that. There are also other dimensions to dementia. The connective tissue, which sort of connects, is something called tau, which is a protein, and formation of tangles is part of the process of cognitive decline. So there are drugs which are being experimental drugs which are being used to see whether they can affect that. And also, of course, the area around inflammation. And there are a couple of drugs. Sargamostim is one of them, and pioglitazone as well is another. Pioglitazone is a drug which we normally use for diabetes. And both of these drugs have been used, or people have attempted to use them in the management of inflammation, with a hope that it will affect the development of cognitive decline and dementia. To date, I might add, with very little success. Certainly, pioglitazone, there was a reasonable study made on the use of pioglitazone, which was unsuccessful. And in terms of Salmegrostim, it does work to a degree, but sadly it works on mice better than on people. So we're not quite sure exactly how and why these drugs don't work. But anyway, part of the real message I want to give you today, if anything, the real message, is that there's plenty more we can do other than think in terms of the next big drug that's going to come and save us all. Because I don't think we're in a state whereby it is likely that's going to happen very soon. We've been waiting for the next big drug really over the last 10 or 15 years with very, very little in the way of results to show for it. But we know there's plenty more we can do in terms of managing our own health and also assisting people in managing theirs. That it doesn't mean that the situation is hopeless by any stretch of the imagination. So in terms of what's next, well, let's start talking about beta amyloid. The only way we can manage to try to sort out beta amyloid is really to get the immune system to try to manage it for us. In other words, to try to reduce it for us. And the drugs I'm going to be talking about are really the drugs which have an effect here. There's also another drug which is being experimented with to prevent destruction of protein to lead to beta amyloid formation. But to date, that hasn't really been very successful. But there are things which I think we should talk about, and they're the monoclonal antibodies. So I don't know how many of you have heard of aducanumab. Aducanumab, or Aduhelm, was a drug which supposedly offered great hope when it was first tested. It must be about 6 or 7 years ago, but then it failed all the endpoints, and it really went nowhere. It just, the drug companies decided they weren't going to develop it. Then suddenly, about a year or so ago, or a year and a half ago, they said, we re-looked at the studies, and perhaps there is some benefit here. And it was a drug which was presented to the FDA, which is the American licensing organization, similar to our MHRA, to become a drug of use in the management of dementia in the United States. To say there was great controversy in the way it was licensed is, to put it mildly. Half the advisory committee resigned over its adoption. It was adopted by the FDA, and some people think that perhaps that's because there was nothing much to offer people with dementia in the US, and the lobbying of the Alzheimer's groups around a drug that worked or seemed to work was significant, but it eventually got licensed under so many conditions that in many respects it hasn't really been used as it had been hoped it would have been used. So to some degree, it just demonstrates the difficulty in designing drugs for dementia. The next big drug which was coming around the corner was gantenerumab. And gantenerumab was a drug which people had great hope for. And towards the end of last year, the sudden news was that it had also failed its endpoints. And so sadly, it just vanished. That's another monoclonal antibody which perhaps we're not going to be able to use as we had hoped we would use. But we still have some where there is some hope. Lecanemab is a drug which is at present being considered for licensing in the United States. It certainly seems to have had an effect on 27% of the people who took it. That may not sound like much, but certainly it is statistically significant. This drug is likely to be licensed really over the next few months. I don't necessarily think it's coming to England straight away. The experience of aducanumab was such that I think there is a degree of caution around this. Of course, we need to remember as well, not only are these drugs expensive, but they're also quite onerous to give. Some are intravenous. I mean, gantenerumab was the one which wasn't intravenous. So in many respects, it was thought to be the one which could be used in communities. But the others tend to have to be dosed in a way whereby hospitalization is required. So they're not going to be very easy to use. And the other one coming up on its tail is donanemab, and that is now going into phase 3 trials to see whether it actually passes its endpoints. So what I tried to demonstrate is that the new drugs which are coming around the corner certainly are an improvement on what we had, because to a degree we didn't have an awful lot. But I wouldn't think, and I wouldn't want you to think, that we're on the verge of some great discovery whereby we're going to have the answer to this condition, because the answer is going to be made up of a whole host of different interventions, I would suggest. And drug treatment may well be part of them, but not necessarily the major part of them. And I think that's an important message for us to be thinking of. So what should we do? Well, as I would suggest, there is a vast amount of things we can do. We've learned as far away as the 1980s that there is a significant connection between the heart and the brain. I'm sorry, this sounds so obviously self-evident, but sadly, it doesn't appear to be self-evident. I remember going to see leaders of, and diabetologists in England around the connection between diabetes and dementia. And of course, there is a connection. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it isn't necessarily recognized. We still practice medicine in the Western world by body parts to a degree, and we tend to forget about these connections. And the NUN study is really quite famous. It was started in the 80s in the United States, and it, in essence, was a whole host of postmortems on nuns. Yes, the monastic order, nuns, as they died in convents, looking, because of course they were quite old, looking at the connection between the different types of dementia. As you know, there are many types of dementia. The commonest being Alzheimer's, and the second commonest being vascular dementia, but there are many others as well. There's PICS, there's a whole host of them. And what is interesting about this study is that the connection between vascular dementia and Alzheimer's was much more significant than had been realized. And this is really quite important, because we know there are things we can do to reduce the risk significantly in the vascular dementias. And clearly, being faced with information like in 85–86% of cases, there is an element of vascular dementia in every case of Alzheimer's disease, means that risk reduction at scale and risk reduction is really worth pursuing, because we can make a difference. Because even though we can't necessarily affect the Alzheimer's disease process, we can certainly affect the vascular dementia disease process. And of course, if we do that, we can reduce the symptomatology associated with cognitive decline. And that, of course, is extremely good news. But so that's the theory. But what about the practice? Well, we have been through the practice as well, because there was a seminal study which took place about 8 or 9 years ago now, called the Finger Study, led by a Finnish doctor, Mia Kivi-Pelto, lovely lady, who really spent her life trying to manage to convince populations to adopt risk reduction at scale of cardiovascular events, not that dissimilar to the attempts we make, for example, in the health check. the same sort of things, i.e. blood pressure. I'll come back to all of these, managing weight, stopping smoking, etc. We now know that through her work, because she published a study of a population which was actually managed very, very aggressively to manage the risks of that population as against the control in Scandinavia, and found, even after 3 years, a statistically significant difference in the level of cognitive decline. And since then, we know 45% of cases could be delayed or even could never happen, because of course we die of something else before they develop. So these processes, these attempts to manage dementia really do have an effect upon people. As you all know, one of the most significant risk factors around dementia is aging. But of course, we now know that dementia is not invariable as you age. There are things you can do. And what are the messages that we need to think about? And as I said, aging is a risk factor, but Alzheimer's is not inevitable. Cardiovascular risk factors, obesity, smoking, exercise, are really, really, really important. And managing that process is really going to make a significant difference. And we do know that there's a connection between the heart and the brain, because we know that managing hypertension, which is exceptionally important, managing strokes, managing AF so people won't get strokes, really at the end of the day stops people developing dementia. And it's never too late to start. This is like with smoking. So it's always worth actually managing these conditions. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to teach you how to suck eggs, because we know what the risk factors are. We know we have to manage blood pressure. We know physical exercise is really useful. We know diabetes is a significant risk factor, by 33%. It really does make a significant difference. So it's really important to manage all the other risk factors. In diabetes, you tend to die of large vessel disease, of strokes and conditions like that. So anyway, we're managing that, which is why we're seeing a relative reduction. Heart disease, obviously, smoking, we mentioned. Drinking, not water, good hydration is really important, but obviously excess alcohol. And diet, we're finding out that diet is perhaps more important than we thought, and Mediterranean diets again and again come out tops in terms of importance. Maintaining cognitive ability and managing chronic kidney disease, again, really important biomedical risk factors. So, what are the big 5 things? And I think these are the big 5 messages for us. Some I think you may not have heard of, many you will have heard of. I think we really need to start thinking around changing the paradigm of aging from the signs we used to see in the street of 2 older people with sticks crossing the road, to us thinking of doing some wacky things as we age. And I do a lot of international work, and one of my fondest memories is when I was in the US at one point, joining a class to learn how to snowboard, except I was the only person significantly under the age of 80 who's doing that. Everybody there was 80, and I thought, snowboarding? You must be damn joking. Well, I wasn't joking. But I think we need to change our mind around things which are available. So, for your grannies and for your grandpa and for your aged aunts, for Christmas, perhaps thinking in terms of giving them a pass to the park may be more useful than giving them a box of chocolates or a slice of soap. Keeping them active is really important. And exercise, of course, is particularly relevant. We know that abdominal girth, particularly in middle life, is a significant risk factor, and managing that is very important. Hearing loss. Now, we'd never thought hearing loss was that important, but really through the work of people like Jill Livingston from UCL in the Lancet Commission, we found that hearing loss is a significant risk factor to dementia. Why? Well, we're not sure, of course, but partly because it sort of shuts people out of society. And I'll come back to this in terms of connecting, but hearing loss is important. So, you know, encouraging people to use their hearing aids. Yes, I know they're fiddly. Trying to ensure people wear them, because the moment you go into your world, the likelihood of you developing cognitive decline as well as depression start to increase. Gingivitis. In many respects, the state of your gums is a window on the level of inflammation which is present. So having good gingival health is really important, whether you have teeth or not. Because if you manage your gingivitis, it means you're managing the inflammatory process in your body. And doing that actually makes a significant difference to the chances of you developing and the speed with which people develop cognitive decline. Learning, again, use it or lose it is something that Alistair, who was the head of dementia for NHS England, Alistair Byrne, and I used to always talk about, because it's really important to try to learn something new. I mean, I practice what I preach in this respect, because every couple of years I try to do something new in terms of job, and usually the something new is something I know the square root of nothing about. And I like the thought I know nothing about it, because that way I have no choice but to learn, and usually learn fast, because sod's law, usually within about 3 weeks, I'm talking to somebody about it. So learning is really important. New language, doesn't matter what it is. The same sort of thing is being productive in terms of employment or volunteering. And that also touches on connecting and being part of society. We know this does make a significant difference. We know that people who are connected with their peers, with the people around them, people who feel loved and supported, actually have a far better outcome. So I didn't really want to rabbit on for long. What I wanted to do is give people an opportunity to really have a conversation, which is what I hope I managed to do. So I'm going to shut up now, because I've been speaking for 20 minutes, and back to you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Sort of whistle stop all sorts of new bits and drugs and brain health. So let's just see if there are, first of all, any questions in the chat box. I can see that somebody's posted a. Oh, thank you, Sharon. You put some of the images of aging. Yeah. Lovely image library if people want to access it to get some better symbols of aging rather than the two people across the sticks across the road. Lots of people finding it interesting. There is a question from Becky. Becky, did you want to ask that? Or do you want me to?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Becky.
We can.
Yeah, I was just interested. I mean, I've heard obviously about the Mediterranean diet, and I just wondered if there's any evidence or studies around like that being made accessible or adapted to particular groups, because obviously that's not everybody's starting point, is it? So that's quite a complex thing to like advise people to do. Like you can say it, but
I know you're absolutely right, Becky, because you know, you have to eat fish and nuts and this and that. It's all very well to say it, but the doing it is something else. And the availability of these things for populations is also something else. Yes, you're right. Really, what I'm trying to demonstrate is what the evidence is. Now, the adoption of that at scale obviously will vary depending on where you are. You know, inevitably, what works in one country and what works in one area doesn't necessarily work anywhere else. it would be really easy. And actually, Mia Kivipelto, the finger trial, she's trying to actually develop the process of worldwide fingers, because people are doing finger trials all over the world, even in the United Kingdom. I think UCL is, or Imperial is doing something around this, actually. So it isn't easy to contextualize new approaches, because in many respects, what you do is in one country, it doesn't translate at all. In Finland, for example, they really love and trust their government, which may not necessarily be the case in larger countries like the United Kingdom. Mind you, I mean, we all laugh, but the same is true in big countries. Small countries seem to have a better sort of relationship, perhaps. So things are much easier to introduce in those places, because people, I wouldn't use the word obey, it sounds awful, but people, you know, accept that this is in their interest, and it doesn't necessarily happen everywhere. Sorry, in short, I don't have the answer, Becky, because the evidence is around a Mediterranean diet, not necessarily a Gujarati, an Asian, or a whatever diet. But that's what people looked at. I hope we'll find, perhaps there could well be evidence of, certainly the nuts bit, which is similar to the fish, could well be translated in other cultures.
Charles, I've got a question, I think, and somebody might have asked it earlier. Have we quantified which factors give the most risk? Because sometimes it's very easy to bombard people with all of those. They'll go, but I'm eating a this, and the fact that I'm smoking, doing all these other things, people think it sort of mitigates the risk. And I just wondered if there was anything that suggested that we could tailor that advice to people's actual own risk factors, and which has the most impact on people's risk of developing dementia.
Just like a GP to ask the impossible question, isn't it? You know, that question plagued me for 3 or 4 years, coming up with an answer to that question. Because you're absolutely right, Sarah, of course. It really would be helpful to say, if you do this, you get so much percentage response. And actually, there is data to show, for example, hearing loss is supposedly the greatest determinant. We know smoking is a very significant determinant, and things like blood pressure. But it's really difficult because of the way we calculate these things. We calculate these things on the basis that individuals only have the single risk factor. And we're back to the arguments around multimorbidity. The fact is, as human beings, 99.9% of us have a whole multitude of risk factors. So how the hell do you manage to isolate one and define the risk associated with one? But it certainly is true that we know that exercise really helps. Obesity doesn't help. Blood pressure management is really important, especially as it's so relatively easy to manage. I say relatively because it's not easy, but at least if it's checked, it could be managed. The problem is, in many respects, it isn't checked. And of course, things, I said smoking already, which is really important. But things like gingival health, we hadn't been thinking of the effect of inflammation. And I think it's really important we start thinking of inflammation, because it will make a difference. We know it makes a difference. Quite how much it makes a difference, now I'm not gonna tell you porcupines. I have no idea.
So I'm going to introduce Sonia from Rotherham, because Sonia had I think the gingivitis bit surprised me. And Sonia, you had a question about whether this was just gingivitis or whether this was other inflammatory processes. Would you like to expand on that question, Sonia? Are you online still?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I was just wondering about it's something I've never thought of. I'm an older adult psychiatrist, so I obviously see a lot of patients with various subtypes of dementia. And again, the reason why I've signed up for this seminar this webinar is the interest in overall health promotion to prevent conditions like this. So the gingivitis bit, really, I've never thought of that, and I just wondered. Obviously, we're talking about inflammation or degree of inflammation, but it's only in your mouth. So what about other chronic inflammation processes? I'm thinking eczema, I'm thinking, you know, any condition that could potentially, you know, have a sort of sustainable inflammatory process. Is there any evidence for anything like that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Gingivitis was identified really about 10 years ago as a risk factor by one of the people involved was a guy called Roberto D'Aiuto, who was he's still alive. Sorry, Roberto, he's not that old either. He's younger than I am. Who's a dentist, a professor of dentistry at I think at UCL as well. I don't know why they're all at UCL, but he seems to be at UCL as well. And he noted a connection between dementia and gingivitis, really by interrogating some of the databases that we have. The databases of the civil servants, the databases, you know, all the databases we have with longitudinal data. So conceptually, absolutely, I would agree. It would be surprising if gingivitis is the only type of inflammation which precipitates and which is a risk factor in terms of dementia. And I would think it is eminently reasonable as a supposition, as a hypothesis, to assume that the same is true for other inflammatory processes. So the only thing about gingivitis, of course, is that it's visible, and the others, mind you, eczema is also visible. I take that back. I'm not aware of any study, but that doesn't mean, by the way, that is not the case. It may be worth having a quick look. I'm sure we'll find the study if we look it up after this meeting around something like eczemas, chronic eczemas. But clearly, any inflammatory process is something which we know could well have an effect upon accelerating cognitive decline. Yes.
Thank you very much, Charles. One of the questions that I think Colin and I have often talked about is when is a good time, thinking to do that prevention message. You know, how, you know, do we start, you know, we've got health checks, I think they're over 45 or 50. Is that a good time? Is that too early? Actually, is it too late? Is the damage being done? Should we be starting earlier? Is this primary care's job, or is it more of a public health message? Any idea when we should start?
Now, I'm not going to talk about whose job it is because I don't want to cause another strike today. Thank you very much. So I'll pause on the whose job it is, shall I? We'll talk about that as well, perhaps. But I think our thinking has really changed over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, we now know that non-communicable diseases, cardiometabolic disease in general, the diabetes is, the type 2s I'm talking about, diabetes is, you know, the cardiovascular health, etc., rheumatoid arthritis, are lifelong conditions. And also our management of these conditions is really changing. And it's really changing because we are now talking about two specific phases. And those phases are, these are my words, so they're not necessarily in common use, but precision health, which are the health interventions we need to adopt to actually minimize our risks. And the health check was one of those, which I hate the name because I don't like the name health check. It should be something which is lifelong. But it was introduced because the greatest bangs for your buck happen at the age of 40. But that doesn't mean that you get no bangs for your buck if you actually start at 30. It means if you're looking for the most cost-effective way of doing something in a traditional way, do it at the age of 40, not at the age of 30. You said, is it too early to talk about dementia? Well, I got attacked by the newspapers over saying that it isn't too early. because I was accused of saying that asking people in their 40s whether they were batty, which is, I think, really quite disrespectful. But anyway, I think talking to people about the fact that what they do today affects what happens to them tomorrow means you're never too early. We're in a world now where we have precision medicine, like precision health. So, of course, we've got to be talking lifelong. We really should be talking in schools about diets. You know, I was brought up to be much fatter than I am now. So I've had to fight against obesity the whole of my adult life. If only my mum and dad were kinder to me by feeding me less, in other words, shutting me up less and listening to me wail, I may have had an easier time. I don't know. But I think we have to be thinking in terms of life course approaches. And thinking in terms of life-course approaches, of course, being very cognizant, particularly in England, of the horrendous inequalities we live within, because we have bad outcomes here in England, and we also have awful inequalities, which sadly seem to be getting worse despite our best efforts.
Thank you, Charles. There is something, though, isn't there, that when we can see the goal we're trying to prevent, we're more likely to listen to the message, some of that sort of behavioural side of medicine. And one of the things that worries me is people see dementia as being very far away. So actually, do I want to change my whole lifestyle for something that's very far away? Whereas they sort of see heart attacks and
happen earlier, don't they?
Happen earlier. So actually, they can know people and friends who've got it. And I just wonder whether it all just old age people, you know, just think it's so far away that they don't, well, that'll never happen to me because I won't live that long. And
no, I agree with you. I mean, have you ever tried to talk about an 18-year-old about a pension?
Well,
yeah. Good point.
What do you mean pension? Who cares?
I agree. I'm just going to, this isn't a question, I want to give Susan a chance to do a shameless plug, because when we were going to try and fill this slot, Charles, when we heard that Professor Muir wasn't here, I had some slides and I said, well, I can think about the brain health check-in. And actually, we've got the expert with us. Susan, tell us about it, because I think people will be really interested in a real practical way of looking at some of this.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Sorry, it's a shameless plug. Hi, Charles, good to see you. Hi, I'm Susan Mitchell. I'm Head of Policy at Alzheimer's Research UK. We're doing quite a lot of work on brain health at the moment. And just before I get onto our check-in tool, I think this conversation about how you frame dementia comes back to why brain health is so helpful. We did some work a few years ago, and brain health actually engages all ages. You're right, when you talk about dementia, you know, that's beyond your pension and you're not thinking about a pension. So if we talk about brain health from some of the work we did with members of the public, it's a much more engaging term, and you can use it at all stages. And it offers, I think, a bit of physicality to all of this and that reframing about this, which is so important. And I think your point about behavioural science is really important, Sarah. So I think it's somehow about how we bring people to the topic and show it's relevant to them at all ages. And I agree, Charles, we should be getting this into schools. That's a whole separate challenge. Anyway, to come back to the Think Brain Health check-in. So this is a tool that we launched a couple of months ago that's been really positive. Over 200,000 people in this country, I think, have used it so far, which is a good step forward. If you Google Think Brain Health check-in, you'll find it. I put a link in the chat. It is, and I'll be really honest, it's quite a simple set of questions which are really there just to empower, engage people. So they answer a series of questions about their lifestyle, some of their choices, what's happening with their health. And then they get some feedback about what they're doing well and some small steps they could take to go forward. It is by no means a risk stratification tool. It's by no means telling them about their risk, but it's just trying to kind of address some of that interest in the topic and to start to give information at a basic level. So, you know, thinking about hearing checks and the importance of addressing hearing loss, we have a link through to the Royal National Institute for the Deaf, who've got an online hearing screen that you can use, 3 minutes free, and then that gives you a first step about going forward. So it's some really small steps. So, you know, this is not a bells and whistles, and it is not as, you know, as full on as the NHS health check, which in itself is really important, but it's just there to kind of raise awareness, and it's something you can direct people to. It's free. People can choose to get more information from the charity, but they by no means have to. So it is there, out there. You know, if there are ways to share it and use it for the good, then that is great.
Has anybody?
So that's my shameless plug.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Sarah. Susan, it's lovely. It's absolutely lovely to see you, by the way. But it all is about small steps. So you're absolutely on the button. It's all about small steps. There isn't the magic key. So let's embrace the small steps.
Good. You know, I think that is important, and I think sometimes it can be quite overwhelming for people to think about all the things they can do. And I do think that point, as we've said already, about it's at any age you can make a positive step. And it's not just, you know, so much of this isn't just for dementia, it's for other things. So it's that kind of snowball. The one small step is about multiple health conditions. And as ever, you know, we work for a dementia charity, but I'm really mindful that most of this is multi-condition. And so, you know, you get it right for one area, you're getting it right for all areas. Anyway, it's been a really interesting conversation. So I'm glad I could throw in my thoughts.
Has anybody tried it? Because I have. And I thought it was great. Because it's not.
I'm glad you liked it, Sarah. If you're going to say, "Oh, it was dreadful," I'll be like, oh,
"No, I really liked it." And what I liked about it was, it was all it was really positive. So it told you what you did well. Because you know, if we think that life's never, you know, the message is too hard, we're not going to try, are we? And then it gave you actual realistic things about what to do to actually change, which I thought was great. So I thought it wasn't blaming, and I think. One of the worries I have about dementia prevention is that people will feel that stigmatized further if they develop dementia because they could have prevented it. And I think that's a really hard thing to try and overcome. So I love the words brain health rather than preventing dementia. And yeah, I thought it was a really positive thing. So if anybody else has got had a look at it, and if you haven't, do, because I thought it was great. And I'm so glad you're on today, Susan. It's really good for you.
And you know, feel free to share it, and if you've got feedback, there are different ways to get back in touch. We'd always welcome feedback because obviously we want to make it useful. And yeah, feel free to share it with whoever you can. We'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Well, people are trying it while we're talking, Ian.
I think so, yeah.
Which is brilliant. Okay, I'm just looking at other stuff that's coming up in the chat. Sarah Partington. Sarah, do you want to tell us a bit about what you're doing at Bradford University? Because it sounds like you're doing some stuff to try and tell us who your students are when you're taking lessons for students around cooking.
I think she might have had to go,
Sarah. All right, well, never mind. Sarah and I know each other well, so that's why I picked on her. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at any other questions that are coming up. Somebody did ask a simple one about types of diabetes and which type 1 or type 2. I thought it was both. I hope that's right, Charles, before I'm spreading misinformation.
Yes, I mean, type 2 obviously is associated with all the cardiometabolic diseases even more. So clearly, you know, it goes with obesity. It goes with cardiovascular disease usually.
Carol put an interesting one in there. I don't know if you're online still, Carol. This was about, and I don't know how many people have heard of it, something called the Q risk for heart disease. And this is one where it does try and quantify things, and it gives you a little score. Forget it right, age, blood pressure, cholesterol. Maybe some family history, can't remember what else is in there. And they come up with a score. And if you got on over a certain score, they say you could have a statin. And could it not be highlighted at this stage somebody's risk of dementia? And I suppose that's where the treatment for the Q risk is the statin. I'm not sure yet whether we know enough about statins to say, or do we, Charles, about that, because they reduce inflammation as well in the way they work. Do we know?
They introduce inflammation. You're absolutely correct. There have been lots of studies looking at statins directly and cognitive decline, and people haven't found the connection. Having said that, they found the connection between a healthy cardiovascular system, which obviously is connected. This issue of calculators and risk scores is really, really interesting, because I spent, as Susan knows, because she was around then, spending years trying to find a good risk calculator for dementia. And in many respects, what defeated us is the fact that it was very difficult to agree upon the levels, which were different from moderate risk to severe risk, as always, scientists love talking about whether it's 0.46 or 0.47, which is the demarcating line. And that used to take weeks or months or years of discussion. But there's something else which actually is a function of the way we think about medicine in the West. And, I go back to medicine by body part. If you look at what the optimal blood pressure for your brain is, it may well be different to the optimal blood pressure for your heart or for your kidneys. So you could be in real deep trouble here, because you could have somebody to come and see you, say, I'll do the risk score for your dementia, for your brain health, and your risk score for your brain health is so much. Or rather, your life expectancy in terms of your brain health is so much. For your heart, it's different, and for your kidney, it's different. Now, which do you want to preserve, and which do you want to sacrifice? God, that's going to be a very complex conversation, and also a completely illogical conversation you're going to have with an individual who doesn't think in terms of hearts and kidneys and brains, who thinks of human beings instead. So I think there are some problems there. The Q risk and all the risk factor tools that we use in cardiovascular are really useful, but they also have limitations, of course. And certainly the original ones, the famous Framlingham scores, which we used to use, were really based upon white populations in Boston, United States, and really only measured 10 years. So if you were 40, for example, and you were unbelievably obese, smoked 60 cigarettes a day, did everything wrong, your chances of actually dying over the next 10 years were going to be pretty low. So you could end up with a low Framlingham score, even though you were a horrendous risk, but over 10 years. And I think we're moving now to more lifelong approaches, because I think that's what we need to do. It's very easy, depending on when you take a risk score, that you're always normal. Oh, I'm perfectly normal. I'm perfectly normal because you're 40. If you were 60, you would be anything but normal. So I think we need to factor that into our thinking.
Thank you very much. One of the things, I don't know if many people have seen it, I'll pop it in the chat box, a new paper that's recently come out, and that was in the Lancet only very recently. What do you think do we need to pay greater attention to brain health with people with mild cognitive impairment, and where do we need to be, that's something that we could be doing sooner rather than later, and actually something that is, how much evidence is it that by giving people at that stage information about prevention would actually reduce decline of cognition for people with mild cognitive impairment? Have you any thoughts on that, Charles?
Well, we spent hours and hours considering whether to introduce processes around mild cognitive decline. But of course, it's actually quite difficult to measure. And I'm sure I'm going to get people who'll fill the chat up with, no, it's easy to measure. You do this test. Well, yes, but there is a certain level of inconsistency. If you do the test every day for 3 or 4 days, you get somewhat different results here, especially with the milder forms of cognitive impairment. So there is difficulty in the test, number one. Secondly, medicalizing a significant part of the population, in my opinion, isn't necessarily a particularly good idea. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about risk reduction. We shouldn't be talking about health promotion to everybody from the moment they're born. And my suggestion and my view is that we should be highlighting healthy behaviors. We should be highlighting the dangers of certain other behaviors at whatever age, because, as I said before, what you do today affects where you are tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So I think the answer is no and yes, or yes and no, depending on which order you put them.
So I have put the link to the paper in there so that you can have a look at it, because I think it is quite interesting, and maybe it's around that whole secondary prevention, because a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today is what we call primary prevention. It's stopping you getting anything, but once we've got mild cognitive impairment, would secondary prevention kick in? Right, we're running towards the end of time, and I don't want to make sure that everybody's had a chance to ask questions, or or make a comment. You don't have to ask a question, but if you think there's other stuff that you want to share with people, Colin, you've put a question in the chat box.
Yeah, just thoughts on the use of technology to help with our brain health, Charles. We're in this sort of position where we're moving between different generations, aren't we? Generations who were not necessarily brought up in the tech world. But there are lots of things you can, people are engaging with things like Wordle and lots of brain sort of, different bits of apps that you can get on phones, etc. Any thoughts on the use of technology?
Thank you, Colin. I think it's really important, as we said, to challenge yourself. Whether that's learning a new language or doing Sudoku is another matter. For me, the challenge would be becoming a greengrocer for a day and calculating as fast as those guys managed to calculate, a pound of tomatoes and a pound of olives or something. Mediterranean diet, of course. So I think there is evidence that stuff like that actually helps. But you talk about technology, and really it's very exciting looking at how technology is starting to affect the way we're managing our risks. Because I'm doing a lot of work in Scandinavia at the moment, and they're doing some really quite extraordinary things, both in terms of identifying people from their genomic profiles that they are more at risk of developing cognitive decline, because there are certain people who are more at risk, and they can be identified. But also there are some behavioral scientists who are quite extraordinarily looking through medical records using new processes like machine learning and AI to identify the appropriate approach for personalizing the messaging, in other words, to such a degree that you're going, whoa, this is amazing, and doing it on population basis. Yes. So I think we're moving into a world whereby we are going to be using more technology. I worry about this a little, because sadly, sometimes we use technology in a way where we negate what is the most important, which is human interaction, which you can't produce using a Zoom call or a Teams call. I can see you in 2 dimensions. I can't see whether you're really listening. I can't see whether you're reading something, you really need to be in the same room with somebody. We understand that. But we are starting to learn that perhaps blended approaches, whereby we're using digital technologies as extenders of that human interaction, can work. And there are various technologies as well which assist us in managing to connect if it's connecting, to learn if it's learning, even to manage our blood pressure, exercise, Fitbits and things, and all these things help in the right place.
Yes, thank you.
Now, I can see that somebody, sorry about the phone call, I can see that somebody has asked a question about brain health pathways and clinics, but I can't see the original question. And I just wondered if we had a last few minutes to answer that one. Any suggestions on how we can set up a service or a pathway that's akin to brain health clinics? Susan.
Hello, can I jump in there? And I did respond if anyone wants to. Yeah, so obviously brain health, we've got brain health, we've got brain health clinics. Brain health clinics is an idea that's proposed a few years ago in the Edinburgh Consensus, led by Craig Ritchie. And this is the idea of a slightly different model. Some of it's been driven by researchers, and some of it's driven by people wanting to kind of improve services, particularly in terms of kind of accuracy of diagnosis. And obviously Charles talked earlier about the various things happening with potential new treatments. So they are at a bit of an interface and they're quite organic. There is a coalition being set up, which is trying to work out how more of these could be rolled out to understand how they can be most effective. It's really just kicking off at the moment. Alzheimer's Research UK is helping to support that because we think it's a really interesting model. I've put my email address in the chat and I'm really happy to share any more information about that as helpful. I mean, I think the brain health, the Edinburgh Consensus, which was, I think, in BNJ a few years ago, is really helpful. And I can find a link for that as well. But yeah, if you want to email me, I can put people in touch. The coalition is just forming and I think it's interested to it's got both people who are leading brain health clinics. For example, we did some work with the Oxford Brain Health Clinic, but we know there are more around the country. But it's also really interesting trying to support people who are perhaps at the start of that journey. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. It has real potential. It's not just obviously about primary prevention. It can be about improving diagnosis, potentially access to new treatments should they be available, but also participation in research. So there's a win in different ways for different people depending on your interests and ambitions.
What a brilliant end to the session. Thank you so much, Susan. Running to the last couple of minutes, I would like to thank Charles for the slides and taking the time and stepping into the breach.